Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of visiting the royal palace. At 23, she had saved every penny from her job at the local bookstore to afford this trip to London. The golden gates and towering walls seemed like something from a fairy tale as she walked along the perimeter that crisp October evening. The palace grounds were quieter than usual. Most tourists had already left for the day, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestone pathways. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around herself as she continued her walk, completely absorbed in taking photos of the magnificent architecture. She didn't notice the group of 3 men who had been following her for the past 10 minutes. They had spotted her earlier near the main entrance, a young woman alone with an expensive camera hanging around her neck. To them, she looked like an easy target, a tourist who probably carried cash and valuable items. The men kept their distance at first, watching as Sarah stopped frequently to take pictures. They whispered among themselves, planning their approach. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar across his left cheek, had done this before. He knew exactly how to corner someone without drawing attention from the few remaining people in the area. As Sarah rounded a corner near the palace's east wing, she found herself in a more secluded area. The street lamps here were dimmer, and there were fewer people around. She was so focused on getting the perfect shot of the palace illuminated against the darkening sky that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her getting closer. The attack happened suddenly. One moment Sarah was adjusting her camera settings, and the next, rough hands grabbed her from behind. Her camera fell to the ground with a loud crash as she was pushed against the cold stone wall of a building adjacent to the palace grounds. "Give us your money and that fancy camera," the scarred man demanded, his breath hot against her face. His 2 companions flanked her on either side, blocking any chance of escape. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized how isolated this part of the street was. "Please, I don't have much money," Sarah stammered, her voice shaking with fear. She could smell alcohol on their breath and see the desperation in their eyes. These weren't just opportunistic thieves. They seemed dangerous, unpredictable. From his post near the palace gates, Royal Guard James Thompson was finishing his evening patrol. At 28, he had been protecting the royal family and palace grounds for 6 years. His training had taught him to be observant, to notice things that others might miss. Even though his shift was technically ending, something in the distance caught his attention. Through the dim light, he could see a commotion near the east wing. It looked like 3 people surrounding someone smaller. His instincts, honed by years of service, told him something was wrong. According to protocol, he should radio for local police assistance since this appeared to be happening just outside the official palace boundary. But there wasn't time. The situation looked urgent, and James could hear what sounded like a woman's voice, frightened and pleading. His training warred with his conscience as he watched one of the men raise his hand as if to strike the victim. In that moment, his human instincts overrode his military orders. James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following protocol, he abandoned his post and ran toward the sound of trouble, his heavy boots echoing against the pavement as he sprinted through the shadows toward what he could now clearly see was an assault in progress. The 3 attackers had Sarah cornered completely now. The scarred man grabbed her purse while one of his companions snatched at her jewelry. When Sarah tried to resist, pulling her bag back toward herself, the 3rd man slapped her hard across the face. The sound echoed off the stone walls around them. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the leader snarled, his grip tightening on her wrist. Sarah could feel tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized how helpless she was. The few people she could see in the distance were too far away to help, and it was getting darker by the minute. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Sarah heard the sound of running footsteps approaching fast. The attackers heard it too and turned to see a tall figure in a dark uniform sprinting toward them. Even in the dim light, the royal insignia on James's uniform was unmistakable. "Let her go, now," James shouted as he reached the group. His voice carried the authority of someone trained to handle dangerous situations. The 3 men immediately took a step back, surprised by the sudden appearance of palace security. But they didn't run. The scarred man looked James up and down, noting that he was alone and appeared to be off duty. "This isn't palace property, mate," he said with false confidence. "You've got no authority here. Walk away and mind your own business." James positioned himself between Sarah and her attackers. Even though the man was technically correct about jurisdiction, James wasn't about to walk away from someone in danger. "I said let her go," he repeated, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. The tension in the air was thick. Sarah, still pressed against the wall, could barely believe that help had arrived. She had heard about the Royal Guards and their reputation for being highly trained, but seeing one in action was different than she had imagined. The leader of the attackers made a crucial mistake. Thinking he could intimidate James, he pulled out a knife from his jacket pocket. The blade gleamed in the streetlight as he pointed it menacingly. "Last warning, guard boy. This is none of your concern." James's training kicked in immediately. He had dealt with armed suspects before, though never technically outside his jurisdiction. His body tensed as he assessed the threat level and calculated his options. The man with the knife seemed nervous, which made him even more dangerous. "You're making a big mistake," James said calmly, his years of experience helping him keep his voice steady. "Put the weapon down and walk away. No one needs to get hurt here." But the situation was escalating quickly. The other two attackers moved to flank James, thinking they could overwhelm him with numbers. They clearly underestimated what 6 years of royal protection training had taught him about handling multiple threats. Sarah watched in amazement as James seemed to assess everything happening around him in seconds. She could see his eyes tracking each attacker's position and movements. Despite her fear, she felt a surge of hope. This guard didn't look like someone who would back down easily. The scarred man made his move first, lunging forward with the knife. But James was ready. Using techniques learned in countless training sessions, he sidestepped the attack and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. What happened next would be talked about for weeks among the palace security staff, and would ultimately put James's career in jeopardy, even though he was doing what he believed was right. The fight was swift but intense. James used his training to disable the knife-wielding attacker first, then turned to face the other two men who were now charging at him together. His movements were precise and controlled, each action calculated to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, watching in disbelief as James handled all three attackers. Within minutes, two of them were on the ground, and the third, the scarred leader, was backing away, clutching his twisted wrist. "This isn't over," the leader spat before helping his companions to their feet. The three men quickly disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the knife and Sarah's scattered belongings. James immediately turned his attention to Sarah, who was shaking from the ordeal. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, his professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. The authority in his voice was replaced with kindness as he helped her gather her things. "I think I'm okay," Sarah replied, though her voice was still trembling. "Thank you so much. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." She looked at the broken pieces of her camera scattered on the ground and felt tears welling up again. "We should report this to the police," James said, pulling out his radio. But as he was about to make the call, they both heard the sound of an official vehicle approaching. James's heart sank as he recognized the distinctive engine of his supervisor's car. Captain Reynolds stepped out of the vehicle, his face already showing signs of displeasure. As the head of palace security, he had been monitoring radio communications and had noticed James's absence from his assigned post. When he couldn't reach James by radio, he had come looking for him. "Thompson," Captain Reynolds called out sharply. "What exactly are you doing here? You're supposed to be at the East Gate, and you're not responding to radio calls." James stood at attention, knowing he was in serious trouble. "Sir, I witnessed an assault in progress and intervened to help this civilian," he explained. Gesturing toward Sarah, Captain Reynolds looked around, taking in the scene, the broken camera, Sarah's disheveled appearance, and the knife still lying on the ground. His expression grew more serious as he began to understand what had happened. "Thompson, you know the protocols," Captain Reynolds said sternly. "When incidents occur outside palace grounds, we contact local authorities. We do not abandon our posts to play hero." Sarah stepped forward, still shaken but determined to speak up for the man who had saved her. "Excuse me, sir, but this officer saved me from being robbed and possibly worse. Those men had a knife and there wasn't time to wait for someone else." Captain Reynolds looked at Sarah with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. He understood that James had done the right thing morally, but from a military standpoint, he had violated direct orders and protocols. "Miss, I'm glad you're safe," And I'm proud that one of my guards helped you, the captain said carefully. But Thompson here has duties and responsibilities that extend beyond individual situations. When he leaves his post, he potentially puts the entire palace at risk. James remained silent, knowing that anything he said might make the situation worse. He had made his choice in the moment, and he didn't regret it. But he also understood the gravity of what he had done from a professional standpoint. The captain called for local police to take Sarah's statement and handle the criminal investigation. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Sarah couldn't help but feel guilty that her rescuer was now in trouble for helping her. What none of them knew was that this incident would soon attract attention from much higher up the chain of command, and the consequences would be far more serious than anyone anticipated. The police arrived within minutes, and Sarah gave her statement while James stood silently beside Captain Reynolds. Detective Inspector Walsh, a veteran officer who had worked cases around the palace area for over 15 years, took detailed notes about the attack and James's intervention. The guard's actions potentially saved this young woman from serious harm, Detective Walsh told Captain Reynolds after speaking with Sarah. The attackers were armed and clearly prepared to use violence. His quick response was commendable, but Captain Reynolds remained concerned about the breach of protocol. Inspector, I appreciate your perspective, but my guard abandoned his post without authorization. In our line of work, that's a serious offense regardless of the outcome. Sarah couldn't stay quiet any longer. How can you be upset with him for helping someone? Those men could have killed me. Her voice carried a mix of gratitude toward James and frustration toward his superior. After the police finished their investigation and left, Captain Reynolds drove James back to the palace in tense silence. James knew he would face disciplinary action, but he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see Sarah's frightened face and hear her pleas for help. The next morning, James was called into a formal disciplinary hearing. The panel consisted of Captain Reynolds, Colonel Harrison from Palace Security Command, and Major Patricia Winters, the head of Royal Protection Services. The atmosphere in the conference room was formal and serious. Guard Thompson, Colonel Harrison began. You are here because you violated standing orders by abandoning your assigned post without authorization. You also engaged in law enforcement activities outside your jurisdiction. These are serious breaches of protocol. James stood at attention as he had been trained to do. Yes, sir. I understand the charges. However, Major Winters interjected, we must also consider the circumstances that led to your actions. You witnessed a violent crime in progress and chose to intervene to protect an innocent civilian. The hearing lasted for over an hour. James explained his reasoning, emphasizing that he felt there was no time to follow standard protocol without putting Sarah in greater danger. The panel asked detailed questions about his decision-making process and whether he had considered alternative courses of action. Meanwhile, news of the incident had begun to spread. Sarah, deeply grateful for James's help, had contacted a local newspaper reporter she knew from college. She wanted to share the story of how a royal guard had risked his career to save her from violent criminals. The reporter, Jennifer Mills, was immediately interested in the story. Here was a tale of heroism and moral courage, but also one that highlighted the sometimes rigid nature of military protocol versus human compassion. She began investigating the incident and discovered that James faced potential dismissal from his position. Within days, the story appeared in the London Daily Herald under the headline Royal Guard Faces, Discipline for Saving Tourist from Attack. The article painted James as a hero who was being punished for doing the right thing. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for James, with hashtags like Save Our Hero and Royal Guard Hero trending across platforms. People shared the story thousands of times, expressing outrage that someone who had risked his safety to help others was facing punishment. Letters and emails poured into the palace from citizens around the world, all demanding that James be commended rather than disciplined. Veterans organizations, women's safety groups, and ordinary citizens all voiced their support for the Guard, who had chosen humanity over protocol. The royal family's press office found themselves dealing with an unexpected public relations situation. What had started as an internal disciplinary matter was now a national news story that painted the palace administration in an unfavorable light. The media attention continued to grow exponentially. Television news programs picked up the story, and James found himself at the center of a national debate about duty versus compassion. Interview requests flooded in from major networks, though palace protocol prevented him from speaking publicly about the incident. Sarah, however, was free to share her story. She appeared on several morning shows, describing in vivid detail how terrified she had been and how James's intervention had saved her from what could have been a much worse situation. He didn't hesitate for a second. Sarah told one interviewer, her voice filled with emotion. When he saw someone in danger, he acted. Isn't that exactly the kind of person we want protecting our country? The story reached international media outlets. News organizations in the United States, Canada, Australia, and across Europe reported on the royal guard who faced punishment for heroism. The palace found itself receiving inquiries from journalists around the world. Inside the palace walls, the situation was causing significant stress for the security leadership. Colonel Harrison called emergency meetings with his senior staff to discuss how to handle the growing crisis. The disciplinary panel that had seemed straightforward was now under intense public scrutiny. "We have protocols for a reason," Colonel Harrison insisted during one heated meeting. "If every guard decides for himself when to follow orders and when to ignore them, we lose all operational effectiveness." But Major Winters disagreed. "Sir, public perception matters. We're being portrayed as an organization that punishes good deeds. That's not sustainable in the long term." Captain Reynolds found himself caught in the middle. He genuinely respected James as a guard and understood why he had acted as he did. But he also believed strongly in military discipline and the importance of following orders. The pressure intensified when several members of Parliament began asking questions about the case. During Prime Minister's questions, the opposition leader specifically asked about the royal guard who is being punished for protecting a citizen from violent criminals. The Prime Minister, clearly briefed on the situation, responded carefully. "This is an internal matter for palace security, but I believe we should always commend those who risk their safety to protect others." Back at the palace, James continued his duties while the disciplinary process continued. His fellow guards showed him overwhelming support, though they had to be careful about expressing it publicly. Many told him privately that they would have done the same thing in his situation. The most significant development came when the story caught the attention of someone very important. Princess Catherine, known for her advocacy work on various social issues, had been following the coverage of James's case. She privately expressed to her security detail that she was troubled by the idea of punishing someone for an act of courage. Word of the princess's interest in the case quickly reached the highest levels of palace administration. Suddenly, what had been a straightforward disciplinary matter became much more complicated. No one wanted to be seen as opposing a decision that had royal sympathy. James remained unaware of the high-level discussions about his case. He continued to report for duty each day, though he noticed that his assignments had been changed to less sensitive positions while the investigation continued. Sarah, meanwhile, had started an online petition calling for James to be commended rather than disciplined. Within a week, the petition had gathered over 200,000 signatures from people around the world who supported the Guards' actions. The petition caught the attention of several celebrities and public figures who shared it on their social media platforms. Actors, musicians, and athletes all expressed support for James, further amplifying the story's reach. As the controversy continued to grow, it became clear that this case would have implications far beyond one guard's career. It was forcing a broader conversation about the balance between following orders and following conscience, between institutional loyalty and moral courage. 3 weeks after the incident, the pressure on palace administration had reached a breaking point. The story showed no signs of fading from public attention, and the negative publicity was becoming a serious concern for the royal household's reputation. The breakthrough came during a private meeting between Princess Catherine and the head of palace security. She had requested the meeting specifically to discuss James's case, expressing her personal view that heroic actions should be rewarded, not punished. "I understand the importance of protocol," the princess said during the confidential meeting, "but I also believe that we must recognize courage when we see it. This young man represents the best values of service and protection that we want associated with the royal family." Her words carried significant weight within the palace hierarchy, while royals typically stayed out of operational security matters. Her perspective on this case was seen as reflecting broader royal values about service and protecting others. Meanwhile, the investigation into the 3 attackers had made progress. Police had arrested 2 of the men based on Sarah's description and evidence from the scene. During questioning, they revealed that they had been planning to target tourists near the palace for weeks, specifically choosing victims who appeared to be alone and vulnerable. Detective Inspector Walsh briefed palace security on these developments. "Your guard didn't just save one person," he told Captain Reynolds. "He likely prevented future attacks on other innocent people. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were predators." This information significantly changed the context of James's actions. What had initially been viewed as a single incident of protocol violation was now understood as an intervention that had broader public safety implications. The disciplinary panel reconvened to reconsider their decision in light of the new information and the unprecedented public response. Major Winters presented a detailed analysis of similar cases from other security organizations, showing that most had commended officers who had acted to protect civilians, even when it meant bending protocol. Colonel Harrison, who had initially been the strongest advocate for strict discipline, found his position becoming increasingly untenable. The combination of royal interest, public pressure, and new evidence about the attackers made it clear that punishment would be both unpopular and potentially unjust. James, still unaware of the high-level discussions about his fate, was called in for another hearing. This time, the atmosphere in the room was markedly different. The stern formality of the previous sessions had been replaced with something that felt more like a commendation ceremony than a disciplinary proceeding. "Guard Thompson," Major Winters began, "after careful review of all the circumstances surrounding your actions 3 weeks ago, this panel has reached a decision." James stood at attention, prepared for the worst. He had made peace with the possibility that his career with the Royal Guard might be over, but he still believed he had made the right choice. "Your actions on that evening demonstrated exceptional courage and a commitment to protecting innocent people," Major Winters continued. "While you did deviate from standard protocol, you did so in circumstances where immediate action was necessary to prevent serious harm to a civilian." The room was silent as James processed what he was hearing. This didn't sound like the beginning of a punishment. "Therefore," Major Winters said, "this panel has decided not only to dismiss all disciplinary charges against you, but to recommend you for a commendation for courage and exceptional service." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. The stress of the past 3 weeks, the uncertainty about his future, and the weight of public attention had all been weighing heavily on him. But more than personal relief, he felt vindicated in his decision to help Sarah. The news of James's exoneration and commendation was released to the media that same afternoon. The palace's press statement praised his courage and reaffirmed the royal family's commitment to protecting the public. The public response to James's vindication was overwhelmingly positive. Social media exploded with congratulations and praise for both James and the palace administration for making what many saw as the right decision. The hashtags that had supported James now celebrated his commendation. Sarah was among the first to hear the news. When a reporter called to tell her about the panel's decision, she broke down in tears of joy. "I'm so relieved," she said. "James deserved to be honored, not punished. He's a real hero." The formal commendation ceremony took place 2 weeks later in one of the palace's grand halls. James's family, his parents, sister, and grandmother, were invited to attend. For a working-class family from northern England, being inside the palace for such an occasion was almost overwhelming. Princess Catherine herself presented James with his commendation, a decision that surprised many observers but sent a clear message about the royal family's support for his actions. During the brief ceremony, she spoke about the importance of courage and the willingness to help others in need. "Your actions exemplify the best qualities of service and protection," the princess told James in front of the gathered audience. "You saw someone in danger and chose to act, despite personal risk and professional consequences. That kind of moral courage deserves recognition." James, dressed in his formal uniform with new insignia, accepted the commendation with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," he said. "I was just doing what I felt was right." The ceremony was covered extensively by media outlets around the world. The images of James receiving his award became symbols of heroism and moral courage, shared millions of times across social media platforms. But perhaps the most meaningful moment for James came after the formal ceremony, when Sarah approached him during the reception. She had been invited as a special guest, and this was the first time they had spoken since that night 3 weeks earlier. "I wanted to thank you again," Sarah said, her voice emotional. "Not just for saving me that night, but for showing everyone that doing the right thing matters more than following rules blindly." James smiled, still somewhat uncomfortable with all the attention. "I'm just glad you're safe," he replied. "That's all that really matters." The case had broader implications beyond James's personal vindication. Palace security reviewed and updated their protocols to provide clearer guidelines for guards who witnessed crimes in progress near palace grounds. The new procedures emphasized the importance of protecting civilians while maintaining security responsibilities. James returned to his regular duties, though his life had changed significantly. He received letters from people around the world thanking him for his courage. Schools invited him to speak about heroism and moral decision-making. He became an unofficial spokesman for the idea that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage to challenge authority. 6 months later, James was promoted to sergeant, a recognition of both his service record and the leadership qualities he had demonstrated during the crisis. His new role included training other guards, and he always emphasized the importance of remembering that their ultimate duty was to protect people, not just follow orders. Sarah returned to her home country but stayed in touch with James through social media. She completed her studies and became a teacher, often telling her students about the importance of standing up for others and doing what's right even when it's difficult. The 3 attackers were eventually convicted and sentenced to prison terms. During their trials, the prosecutor specifically mentioned how James's intervention had not only saved Sarah, but had helped apprehend dangerous criminals who had been targeting tourists. Years later, when James reflected on that October evening, he never regretted his decision to abandon his post to help a stranger in need. The incident had taught him that sometimes the most important moments in life come when you have to choose between following orders and following your conscience. For him, the choice had been clear then, and it remained clear now. Some things he believed were more important than protocol, and protecting innocent people was certainly one of them.